I was 16 when my life took a dark turn. My parents' constant fighting had poisoned our home, and no matter how many times I tried to intervene, the outcome was always the same. Go to your room, Tom. Eventually, the chaos became unbearable. They divorced and I was sent to live with my Aunt Dharma in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. Aunt Dharma was kind, but she had her own world. More often than not, she spent her time with her best friend and neighbor, Mrs. Claire. Claire was in her 50s, but she carried herself with a youthful energy that made her fascinating. Unlike most adults, she actually listened when I spoke. With no friends my age around, our conversations became a daily ritual. Claire's house had an eerie charm. It was decorated with animal furs, draped over furniture mounted on walls, even covering the floors. She often spoke of her late husband, an avid hunter who had filled their home with his trophies. I never questioned the details of her stories, though something about them always felt exaggerated. One afternoon, after one of our long talks, I asked to use the bathroom. On my way back, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I peeked inside. The room was covered in furs. Some were stretched across wooden frames, others folded in stacks, and a few, disturbingly, looked as though they were being prepared for something. Books, maybe. My stomach twisted. I stepped inside for a closer look, running my fingers along the strange textures. They're beautiful, aren't they? I spun around to find Claire standing behind me, watching. Her smile was warm, but there was something off about the way she looked at the furs, like they were more than just decorations. She launched into another story about her husband's hunts. But oddly, she never identified what kind of animals these skins came from. That evening as I walked home, I noticed someone watching me. Jorge. The neighborhood weirdo, everyone avoided him. He never spoke, never interacted with anyone, just lingered on his porch like a ghost. His gaze was unsettling, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Stay away from that man, Tom, Claire had warned. Sometimes people are better left alone. I hurried back to my aunt's house, locking the door behind me. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jorge's stare, unblinking and full of something I couldn't decipher. The next day, Aunt Dharma told me that I'd be moving back with my mother. Apparently, things had settled down between my parents. That afternoon, I went to Claire's house to say goodbye. Her door was open. I stepped inside, calling her name. No answer. As I wandered through the house, I passed the fur room again. My curiosity won over my better judgment, and I stepped inside. That's when I saw it. A small, leather-bound diary resting on a wooden table. Its cover was made of fur, soft, detailed, crafted with an unsettling level of care. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Before I could read a word, Claire's voice whispered behind me. Each skin is more beautiful than the last. I need to collect more. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, staring at me. What do you mean, collect more? I asked. Claire's expression softened as if realizing she'd spoken aloud. Oh, just a silly thought. She chuckled, waving it off. You're leaving, aren't you? That's such a shame. You're the only one who visits me. She invited me to come back one last time for tea that night. I hesitated but agreed. After all, Claire had been kind to me. Hadn't she? By the time evening fell, the strange moment in the fur room had faded from my mind. I headed to her house, eager for our final talk. I barely had time to knock before a hand clamped over my mouth. I was yanked backward with terrifying force. My heart nearly burst from my chest as I saw Jorge, his eyes wide with desperation, dragging me away from Claire's porch. I struggled, kicking and thrashing. He grunted but held firm. Then suddenly, he let go. I bolted for Claire's house, bursting through the door and slamming it behind me. Claire, call the police. Jorge just attacked me. Silence. The room was dark. Candlelight flickered against the walls, illuminating strange carved figures I had never seen before. Then her voice. You have been granted the privilege of being the ultimate beast. Claire emerged from the shadows, her face masked in something tribal, ancient. Her eyes gleamed with a manic excitement. For that, she continued, I will only chase you for 30 minutes. Run, Tom. If you survive, you win. But if you lose... She ran a finger along the edge of a gleaming machete. I will take what makes you beautiful. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the hell is going on, Claire? Pain erupted in my arm. I screamed, looking down to see an arrow buried deep in my flesh. Claire charged, machete raised high. I threw myself to the side just in time, the blade slamming into the wooden floor where I had stood moments ago. Adrenaline took over. I sprinted through the house, crashing through the back door into the dense forest beyond. She was right behind me. Her laughter rang through the trees as I ran, faster than I had ever run in my life. Twigs snapped under my feet. Branches clawed at my skin. I didn't dare look back. I could feel her closing in, then pain, a searing slash across my back. I collapsed, gasping for breath, as Claire loomed over me, her masked face illuminated by the moonlight. This is my favorite part, she whispered. She lifted the machete. A gunshot rang out. Claire staggered backward before collapsing onto the forest floor. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and then Aunt Dharma, the police, and Jorge. I woke up in the hospital, my wounds patched but my mind shattered. Aunt Dharma sat beside me, explaining everything. Jorge had been the one to save me. He had survived Claire's hunt before. She had cut out his tongue to ensure he would never speak of it. But when he saw me getting too close to her, he tried to warn me. In the only way he could, the police searched Claire's house. What they found made my blood run cold. The furs in her collection, human skin. Her late husband had never been a hunter. She was. I returned home after my recovery, but I was never the same. Every time an older person showed me kindness, a sickening memory crawled into my mind. Claire's voice whispering in the dark. Run, Tom. If you survive, you win. But if you lose... And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her laughter in my dreams. Missy had always been a little strange. If she wasn't screaming, she was making noise some other way, banging on walls, muttering to herself, or blasting music at odd hours. At first, we thought it was just her personality, an eccentric quirk of our peculiar neighbor. But everything changed when we discovered the disturbing truth behind her outbursts. The first time it happened, the whole neighborhood ran to her house, thinking something terrible had happened. We even called 911, but when we arrived, we found Missy sitting on the floor of her bedroom, sobbing uncontrollably. What happened? Someone asked. Through choked cries, she stammered, Someone cut my hair." It was obvious she had done it herself. Scissors lay discarded on the floor, tufts of her own hair scattered around like fallen leaves. The police arrived, irritated by the false alarm, and gave us all a stern lecture about unnecessary emergency calls. Missy, embarrassed, promised to be more careful in the future. She wasn't. 3 days later, her screams tore through the night again. The neighbors, perhaps out of some twisted sense of obligation, rushed to her home. This time, she claimed she had come back from the mall to find a dead cat in her yard. "It looked wrong," she whispered, voice trembling. The body was stiff, contorted in an unnatural way, as if it had been arranged. Missy's tears fell in thick, exaggerated streams, so excessive they felt performative, like a bad actress trying too hard. Everyone believed her. But as I watched her, I couldn't shake a thought from my mind. This crazy woman killed a cat for attention. It would make a great newspaper headline. If only I knew a reporter. For weeks, Missy's screams continued, each episode more bizarre than the last. The neighborhood's response evolved from frantic concern to reluctant curiosity. At first, we ran to her door. Then we walked. Eventually, we barely reacted at all. It was a show, a sick, twisted spectacle, and we were her audience. Then came the night that changed everything. At 1 a.m., her wailing echoed through the streets like the toll of a cursed church bell. I nearly ignored it, but something in the sound felt different. Less hysteria, more desperation. I dragged myself to her house and found her collapsed in her living room, tears streaking her face. But this time, there was something else. Blood. She held up her trembling hand. A finger was missing, severed. Gasps filled the room. Someone called an ambulance. But as they swarmed around her, tending to her wound, I stood back, watching. Missy did this to herself. She was unraveling faster than I expected. I had pushed her to the edge, but I never expected her to take that last step. And then the final scream. I was the first to arrive at her house. This time, there was no hysteria, no performative sobs, just silence. Missy lay on the floor, her own kitchen knife buried in her chest. The neighbors arrived, gasping, crying, their hands covering their mouths in shock. Someone called the police, but I wasn't paying attention. My mind was focused elsewhere. That headline? The one I had jokingly imagined weeks ago. Crazy woman kills cat, rips off pinky, and finally commits suicide for attention. It sounded ridiculous, absurd. Yet it had come true. They didn't suspect a thing. Why would they? Missy had left a note. Something vague, cryptic, but drenched in fear. The police ruled it a suicide, and just like that, the chapter of Missy was closed. No one knew the truth. No one knew that I had orchestrated every moment of her madness. The dead cats, the shadows in her windows, the strange whispers outside her door, the paranoia I had carefully planted in her mind. I had made her believe she was losing control, and in the end, she did. 2 days later, my imagined headline was printed in the local paper, word for word. I smiled as I read it, because no one ever suspected me, and they never would. I've never told this story to anyone before. Even now, as I write this, my hands are shaking. But I need to get it out. My name is Lara, and I'm 31 years old. It all started 2 weeks ago when I moved into a new apartment. Since I live alone, unpacking was quick, and by that same afternoon, everything was already in place. I grabbed my purse and keys, ready to head to work, when I saw her. She was standing by the sidewalk, watching me, a woman, thin, frail, with deep bags under her eyes that looked worse the longer I stared. She must have been in her early 50s, but her skin was sallow, aged beyond her years. Her lips blistered and her teeth, those jagged, rotting teeth, sent a chill down my spine. She reeked of cigarettes and something else, something foul. "Hello, miss. Are you the new neighbor?" she rasped, her voice marked by years of smoking. I hesitated but forced a polite nod. "Yes, I just moved in 3 days ago." Her lips stretched into a grin, too wide, too eager. And that's when I noticed it. She was holding something behind her back. The moment she saw me looking, her excitement grew. "I want you to meet someone," she whispered. Then she revealed it. A dollar. It was old-worn and disturbingly lifelike, with beady glass eyes that seemed to watch me. Its mouth was slightly open, as if mid-whisper, and its hair, real human hair, was matted and dirty. "This is Yala," the woman said proudly. "She's been waiting to meet you." The name alone sent a shudder through me. There was something deeply wrong about that doll. Nice to meet you, Yala," I stammered, forcing a nervous smile. The woman's grin widened, exposing those rotting teeth. "I have to go," I said quickly, inching toward my car. Before I could get in, she spoke again. "No need to be so formal. Call me Emma." I nodded, barely listening, and started the engine. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her still standing there, watching. Then in one smooth, unnatural motion, she flicked her wrist, the way a puppeteer moves a marionette. I sped away. That night when I returned home around 4:30 p.m., she was there, in the middle of the parking lot, playing with the doll. She cradled it like a child, whispering to it, brushing its tangled hair with trembling fingers. I muttered under my breath, "What the hell?" As I stepped out of my car, she looked up. Her expression was eerie, her lips stretched into a slow, unsettling smile. I forced myself to walk past her. "Don't look, just go inside." But then she started singing, low and breathy, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Yalla yalla, wake from your sleep. Yalla yalla, secrets to keep." My skin crawled. I walked faster, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Just before I entered the building, I stole one last glance. Emma had stopped singing. She was staring at me, clutching the doll against her chest, her fingers trembling. Something in the air shifted, a feeling of being watched. I rushed inside, locked the door, and exhaled. My hands were shaking. "She's just a lonely old woman," I told myself. That's all. I was wrong. That night I woke up suddenly. My throat was dry, my heart racing for no reason. I reached for my phone, 3:30 a.m. Then I heard it, a knock, software, deliberate. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound came again, knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was my paranoia. I listened to too many horror stories after all, but then a whisper, low, muffled. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound slithered through the silence like a snake in the dark. I clutched my blanket, debating whether to investigate or stay frozen in bed. Then my bedroom door slammed shut. I gasped, throwing myself out of bed. My pulse was erratic, my mind spinning. I ran through the apartment, flipping on every light. Nothing. Everything was exactly as I had left it. But then I checked the bathroom. My stomach twisted. Sitting in the middle of the floor was the doll, Yala. Her empty eyes stared up at me. My breath hitched. I hadn't brought that thing inside. How the hell had it gotten into my apartment? A sick realization dawned. Emma, she had been here. I bolted for the windows and doors, checking the locks. Everything was shut. Everything except the bathroom window. It was open. I felt sick. That's how she got in. That's how she escaped. But how long had she been inside before leaving? Had she watched me sleep? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I stormed into the building manager's office and told them everything. The strange encounters, the doll, the break-in. I told them I wanted out of my lease. To my surprise, they took me seriously. "We've had complaints about Emma before," the manager admitted. "She's a troubled woman. They offered me free rent for a month if I stayed. I hesitated but agreed. I didn't have much money and I had just moved in. A week later, I got news. Emma was being arrested. Apparently, when the manager confronted her about breaking into my apartment, she snapped. She denied everything, then flew into a rage, attacking him, hitting him repeatedly with her fists. They had to call the police. She was being sent to a psychiatric hospital. I should have felt relieved. But one question haunted me. How did she take the doll back? Because when I checked the bathroom that morning, it was gone. And late that night, as I lay in bed, trying to forget the horror of the past 2 weeks, I heard something outside my window. Software, deliberate, a whisper. "Yalla yalla, wake from your sleep. Yalla yalla, secrets to keep." I didn't sleep that night either. I always dreamed of living alone. The thought of independence had clung to me since I was 15, a relentless whisper urging me toward freedom. When I turned 18, I finally mustered the courage to leave my parents' house and carve out a space of my own. School never interested me. I just wanted to work, save money, and escape. It took years of scraping by, working odd jobs, and searching. But eventually, I found an apartment I could afford. It wasn't in the heart of the city like I'd hoped, but it was cozy. And more importantly, it was mine. I was thrilled. This was the beginning of a new chapter, but never, in my worst nightmares, did I imagine that this new beginning would lead me straight into a waking nightmare. It was a bright, cloudless day when I arrived at my new building. Most of my belongings had already been delivered. I only had 2 duffel bags left, which I dragged behind me as I stepped into the elevator. My heart pounded with excitement as I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and my excitement evaporated instantly. A man stood in the dimly lit hallway. He was in his 40s, wearing a pitch-black outfit that swallowed his gaunt frame. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, deep wrinkles carving into his face. A wart clung to his cheek, and the bags under his eyes were so dark they looked bruised. But what unsettled me most was the way he stared, unblinking, hollow, as if studying me from behind a mask of skin. I stepped past him quickly, a shiver running down my spine. As I turned to glance back, he smiled. His teeth were yellowed and crooked, some rotted down to blackened stumps. I snapped my gaze forward and hurried toward my new apartment, 5A. By the time I reached the door, I had convinced myself that he was just an unfortunate-looking man, a strange first impression, nothing more. Still, when I finally stepped inside, I locked the door behind me. Hours passed. I unpacked, organized, and settled in, the earlier encounter slowly fading into the back of my mind. Hunger crept in, so I decided to run to the nearby store. On my way back, my arms weighed down with grocery bags. I turned the corner into my hallway, only to bump straight into him again. He wore a cap this time. As we collided, it tumbled off his head. A chill ran down my spine. His scalp was bald, but it wasn't just skin. It was covered in dark, winding tattoos, the symbols unfamiliar but eerily intricate. The scent hit me next, a wave of something foul, rancid, like meat left out in the sun for too long. I forced a polite apology, my voice tight, but he just stared. Slowly he bent down, retrieved his cap, and placed it back on his head without a word. I hurried into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I saw his reflection in the metal. He was watching me, smiling. That night, as I lay in bed, a scream shattered the silence. It was raw, guttural, piercing through the walls like a blade. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. My breath came in short gasps as I listened, straining to hear anything else. But the hallway outside my apartment remained eerily quiet. The scream had come from next door, from 5B. A cold sweat trickled down my back. My instincts told me to stay put, to lock my doors and pretend I'd heard nothing. But some small, foolish part of me thought, what if someone's hurt? Slowly, I tiptoed to my door and cracked it open. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, silent. I stood there for a long moment, waiting, listening, then a sound, a slow, deliberate click, his door unlocking. I stepped back and shut my own door, twisting the lock into place. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the screams came again the next night, and the next. Days turned into weeks, and I barely slept. The noises coming from 5B only grew worse. Screams, muffled sobs, something wet and heavy dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was none of my business. But the smell, that putrid, decaying stench, seeped through the walls, clinging to my furniture, my clothes, my skin. One night, as I unlocked my door, exhausted from another sleepless shift at work, I heard it again, louder than before. And this time, something inside me snapped. I stormed to his door and pounded my fist against it. "Knock it off!" I shouted. No response. I banged harder. "Hey, I know you're in there." Silence. Then, faintly, a rustling sound. The smell thickened, curling in my throat like smoke. And then I realized the door wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar. My heart pounded against my ribs. I hesitated for only a moment before I pushed the door open. Darkness swallowed the room. The air was thick, humid, wrong. Papers littered the floor, furniture overturned, as if someone had ransacked the place. My breath hitched as I took a cautious step inside. Then I heard it, a wet, squelching noise, coming from the bathroom. I edged closer, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. The door was slightly open. I placed my shaking hand against it and pushed. The light flickered on, and my mind shattered. Blood. So much blood. The bathtub overflowed with it, thick and blackened. Limbs were strewn across the floor, arms, legs, heads, some fresh, some decayed beyond recognition. Hollow eyes stared at me from severed faces, their expressions frozen in silent screams. A swarm of rats scattered at my intrusion, their tiny feet skittering over exposed organs. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. I turned to run, but the lights went out, and in the darkness I heard breathing, close, too close. Then pain, a searing, blinding pain in my hand. I screamed, stumbling backward. My fingers fumbled in the dark until I found the wall, my palm slamming against the switch. The dim light flickered back on, and there he was, standing just inches away. His face, once emotionless, now twisted into something monstrous. His lips peeled back in a wide, unnatural grin, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. In his hand, a hammer dripped with fresh blood, my blood. He lunged. I ran. I barely made it out alive. I don't remember how I got to the police station. I only remember collapsing at the front desk, my vision blackening, my body trembling violently. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me he had disappeared. It took days, but they found him hiding in an abandoned warehouse, along with more bodies. So many bodies. He was a monster, a butcher, a cannibal, and I had lived right next door. I never went back to that apartment. I moved back in with my parents, but I am not the same person I was before. Sleep is a stranger to me now. The nightmares come every night. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. And worst of all, I still hear the screams. The headline on the morning news caught my attention, sending a shiver down my spine. The world had always been cruel, but sometimes its darkness felt unbearable. People committed horrific crimes for no reason, some for power, others for pleasure. There were those who sought nothing more than to hear a person's final screams, as if death itself was a game to them. The story I was reading was about a woman named Barbara, a tragedy so gruesome it made my stomach turn. She had placed an ad online offering hairdressing services and received a response from a man named Mark. He was polite, offering her a generous payment if she could come to his house for a private appointment. The location was close to her home, so she didn't think much of it. It was easy money. When she arrived, she began cutting his hair, chatting casually, unaware of the danger lurking beneath his calm exterior. Mark had no intention of paying her. Instead, he made her a disgusting proposition, offering her money in exchange for sex. When Barbara refused, demanding her rightful payment, his demeanor changed instantly. He grabbed a knife, his eyes dark and unreadable. He overpowered her, his strength too much to fight off. She screamed for help, but no one came. He violated her, recording every second of her suffering on his phone. Then with sickening ease, he strangled her and slit her throat, discarding her body like trash. A neighbor heard her screams but didn't dare investigate. Instead, he called the police. By the time they arrived, it was too late. Barbara was gone. Mark was arrested, but that hardly felt like justice. She was just another name on a list of victims, another life snuffed out by a monster in human skin. I couldn't shake the horror of it, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to a nightmare of my own. A few years ago, when I was struggling to make ends meet. I relied on Craigslist to find work. Babysitting gigs were easy to come by, and one night, I received a call that seemed no different from the rest. A woman needed a sitter, and I agreed without hesitation. I took the bus across town, following the directions she had given me. But when I arrived, something felt off. At the intersection where I was supposed to meet her, a man was waiting instead. I nearly turned around, but then I noticed the 2 children standing beside him. That eased my nerves. Perhaps their mother had to leave, and he had come in her place. The man, blonde and clean-shaven, introduced himself as Elliot Graham. He smiled in a way that felt forced. "My wife, Carrie, had to leave early, so I stayed to wait for you," he explained, extending his hand. I hesitated before shaking it. Something about his grip felt wrong. Too firm, too calculated. We walked a few blocks to his house, an old structure at the very end of the street. As I stepped inside, a wave of unease washed over me. The house smelled musty, the air thick with something unspoken. I noticed more children inside, 5 in total. They didn't talk, didn't smile. They just watched me with hollow eyes. Elliot gave me instructions, his voice smooth and practiced. "They won't give you much trouble," he assured me. "Just make sure they don't go outside." He explained what to cook, when to put them to bed, and then just like that, he was gone. Left alone with the children, I tried to make conversation, but they were eerily silent. The youngest, a dark-haired boy around 3 years old, stared at me without blinking. The others avoided my eyes. Within half an hour, most of them were asleep, except for one, a 6-year-old girl with wide, knowing eyes. She refused to eat. "The food has sleeping pills in it," she whispered. A cold chill ran through me. My mind reeled. Was this man drugging the children? The girl edged closer. "I've been here since I was 4, she murmured. My breath caught in my throat. If she had been here for that long, did that mean she wasn't Elliot's daughter? Heart pounding, I pulled her aside, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who is he?" She hesitated before answering. "His real name is Matt Presley. He takes kids. He sells them." I felt sick. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had walked into something monstrous. Elliot, Matt, wasn't a father. He was a trafficker. He kidnapped children and sold them to the highest bidder. And worse, he sometimes hired babysitters, only to make them vanish too. I had to get out. More importantly, I had to get the children out. I pulled my phone from my pocket and with trembling hands dialed the police. My voice was barely steady as I explained what was happening. "Please," I begged, "send someone now." Minutes later, flashing lights illuminated the house. Officers stormed inside, guns drawn. The children were rescued. I was safe. And Matt Presley, one of the most wanted human traffickers in the country, was finally caught. Later, I learned the full horror of his crimes. He had been abducting children for years, selling them to the highest bidder. But sometimes he sought something darker. Women, nannies, girls who trusted him enough to step through his front door. That little girl had saved me. Her bravery had stopped a monster. I never posted a babysitting ad again. I never wanted to be the kind of person who feared their neighbors, but after what happened, I don't think I'll ever see them the same way again. I'm Lisa, in my early 20s, and I've lived alone for about 4 years now. I moved to a new neighborhood recently, and though I don't mind the solitude, I can't shake the nagging fear that if something ever happened to me, no one would notice, no one would check. It's not just paranoia. It comes from experience. I've had bad neighbors before, but Mark was something else. It started innocently enough. I noticed him walking his dog behind my house, just like plenty of other people in the neighborhood. His dog was adorable, and my cat would play with him through the glass door, batting at the glass. tails flicking, engaged in their little game. One afternoon, the dog ran onto my porch, wagging his tail, and that's when I properly met Mark. He seemed nice, friendly, chatty. We started talking often, usually when I was outside smoking and he was letting his dog out. As the summer evenings stretched on, we'd talk for hours after work. It felt harmless, so I gave him my number. I thought I had made a friend. I was wrong. It didn't take long for Mark to make it clear he wanted more than friendship. He kept bringing up dating, hinting at casual encounters. I was upfront. I wasn't interested. He nodded, said he understood. But he didn't stop. Every conversation circled back to the same thing. Every interaction felt like a push, a test of my boundaries. Then he started inviting me over to his place, over and over. Every time, I said no. Every time, he got defensive, acting like I was being difficult, as if my caution was an insult to him. And when I wouldn't come to him, he started trying to invite himself over to my house. I refused. He didn't take it well. One evening, I was on my porch, enjoying a cigarette, when Mark showed up holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "You have to try this," he insisted, pouring 2 glasses before I could even respond. "It's amazing." I reached for the bottle instinctively, glancing at the seal. It was broken. Something about that unsettled me. The bottle was full, yes, but why was the seal broken? Mark handed me a glass, his eyes expectant. I hesitated. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something in my gut screamed at me. So I faked it. I let the rim of the glass touch my lips, pretended to take a sip, and then smiled as if I enjoyed it. He watched me closely, too closely. As we talked, he suddenly spilled his wine. The dark liquid splashed onto the grass, soaking into the dirt. He swore, wiped at his pants, and immediately refilled his glass. "You've got to catch up," he said, pushing my glass toward me. That's when I noticed he still hadn't taken a sip. Something wasn't right. I smiled, gesturing for him to drink first. He hesitated. Then, as if realizing I was waiting, he raised the glass to his lips and tilted it ever so slightly, just enough to make it look like he was drinking. The wine barely touched his mouth. Every hair on my body stood on end. For the next few minutes, it became a game. Him trying to get me to drink, me dodging it. Finally, I poured the last of the bottle into his glass. "Come on, let's toast," I said. To my surprise, this time he actually drank. I didn't, and then I went inside and locked my doors. 2 nights later, I was outside smoking again when Mark stormed over, his face twisted in anger. "Why won't you go out with me?" he snapped. "Why are girls like you always playing games?" I was stunned. "I told you from the beginning, I'm not interested." He wasn't listening. His voice grew louder, more bitter. He ranted about his ex, about how she had treated him unfairly. Then in a horrifying shift, he started talking about his dog. "She pisses in the house," he sneered. "So I don't feed her sometimes. Don't give her water. She needs to learn." My blood ran cold. I'd always seen him playing with the dog. The poor thing seemed to love him, yet there had been something off. Now I understood. She wasn't excited. She was desperate for attention, for kindness. I felt sick. I mumbled something about needing to meet my friends and walked away, fast. That night my phone exploded with messages. At first they were harmless, then they became desperate, then angry. It was a storm of texts, unreadable walls of frustration, self-pity, and barely veiled threats. I blocked him, but I knew he was still watching me. The last message he ever sent read, "What did I do wrong? I never disrespected you." I never responded. I never spoke to him again. I never drank anything from a broken seal again. And I never ever ignored my instincts again. My name is Garrett, and this happened when I was a sophomore in college. After my freshman year, I didn't get a dorm, so I scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op, a 3-house community, sort of near campus, but not really. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap. And with my bike, the extra travel time didn't bother me. Most of the residents were students like me, though there were a few exceptions. Some alumni, a couple of TAs, and a handful of older people finishing their degrees. But the person who immediately stood out to me was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. She looked to be in her late 50s, though something about her made her seem older. Her graying hair was always unkempt, and she walked with a limp as if her back were permanently bent out of shape. She barely spoke to anyone and always had a blank, unreadable expression. I assume she had some connection to the university, maybe faculty, maybe an alum, but no one explained, and I didn't ask. The first time I saw her do something truly strange was in the common kitchen. The setup was already a little weird. Each of the 3 houses had its own kitchen, so there was no reason for her to be in ours. But there she was, standing in the middle of the room. She wasn't cooking, eating, or talking to anyone. She was just watching. The rest of us moved around her, cooking, chatting, listening to music. No one acknowledged her presence. I caught her eyes a few times and felt an odd sensation, like she was watching me specifically. I knew that was unlikely, but still the feeling stuck with me. A few nights later, I was in my room, finishing up homework, when I saw her again. She was outside, standing in the middle of the street, staring up at my window. The street was empty. The night was cold, and yet she stood there, motionless. I couldn't tell if she was looking at my window specifically or just in the direction of the house, but I felt like she was watching me. For some reason, I waved. The moment I did, I regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped, not high, just a few inches off the ground, like an excited child seeing their parent for the first time in weeks. Then, without warning, she turned and ran, not walked, ran, straight toward one of the other houses. I felt sick. A slow creeping realization settled over me. She had been looking at me, and now she knew exactly which room was mine. That night I asked one of my housemates about her. He shrugged and told me, "She's always been here. Best to ignore her." That didn't sit right with me. When I pressed for more, all he said was that someone had told him the same thing when he moved in. Eventually, I asked a senior from the house she lived in. He told me she had some vague affiliation with the university, maybe an old faculty member, but that she wasn't violent. "She's just weird," he said. "But we can't control who lives here. That's up to the property manager." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but I let it go until things got worse. One night, past midnight, I stepped out of my room and nearly collided with her. She was standing right outside my door. I stumbled back, my heart slamming in my chest. The house was mostly dead, everyone asleep or out. She didn't say anything. She barely even reacted. She just turned and walked away, like we was the one who had intruded. After that, I started seeing her in places she shouldn't be. Wandering the halls, standing in doorways, hovering near the stairs, always silent, always watching. Then I lost my room key. It wasn't a big deal for most people. Most of the rooms were left unlocked anyway. But I wasn't like that. I needed my door locked to sleep. Losing my key wasn't just inconvenient. It made me feel vulnerable. I had a spare, but it still pissed me off. A few nights later, something woke me up. A sound, a soft bump. I lay still, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, a shifting noise like something moving from inside my closet. My body went cold. I'm not the kind of person who freezes up in a bad situation. If there was someone or something in my closet, I needed to deal with it now. Slowly, I slid out of bed. My heart pounded in my ears. Another bump. I took a deep breath. Then I ripped the closet door open and screamed. The woman was inside. She was crouched in the cramped space, one of my ties wrapped around her neck. Her eyes were wide, wild, staring. In her hand, a kitchen knife. For a second, we both stood frozen. Then she lunged. I barely had time to react before she was on me, swinging the knife wildly. I screamed again, this time in real fear. She wasn't strong, but she fought like an animal, biting and clawing as I wrestled her to the ground. I don't know how long I struggled before my friend Lee came running, pulling her off me and pinning her down. Someone else called the cops. The rest of the night was a blur. The police arrived fast. By the time they got there, she had stopped fighting, stopped screaming. She just lay there, blank-faced, silent. They found my missing room key in her pocket. A few weeks later, we got the full story. She was the property manager's sister. He had been letting her live there under the radar. She had severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her the care she needed, he'd thrown her into one of the unoccupied rooms. The property manager was arrested for negligence and more. And as for her, I don't know what happened to her. I should feel bad for her, and part of me does. But that doesn't erase the fact that she tried to kill me. I have no idea why she was so fixated on me, why she stared at my window, why she was outside my door, why she waited for me in my closet. I'm graduating soon. I'll miss college, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop thinking about that night. I've lived in the same modest 2-story home with my husband, Benjamin, for nearly 20 years. Our children are all grown now, out living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. Life had settled into a peaceful routine. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons tending to my little garden, evenings spent listening to true crime podcasts or old jazz records. For the longest time, the house across the street sat empty, its windows dark, its lawn overgrown. Then, last year, someone finally moved in. I remember feeling a sense of relief. I was getting tired of staring at a vacant house every day. The new neighbor was a young man, mid-20s at most, with a sharp sense of style and a taste for luxury. His car, a sleek BMW, always gleamed in the sunlight. His clothes were expensive. His watch glinted whenever he waved at me from his driveway. I could tell right away. He was either well off or desperately pretending to be. His name was Quinn. To my surprise, he was actually quite polite. He introduced himself a few days after moving in, shaking hands with Benjamin and me. He was bright, well-spoken, and got along with my husband instantly. They talked sports, swapped college stories, and debated stock investments. Late into the evening, Quinn mentioned he worked in the entertainment industry, freelancing for some internet personality, whatever that meant. It went over my head, but it was clearly lucrative. For months, everything was normal. I'd see Quinn leave in the mornings, sometimes waving at me as he got into his car, and I'd always wave back. But then, I started noticing her. She always arrived in the same little white convertible, a young woman, blonde, beautiful, the kind of girl you'd expect a man like Quinn to date. She had a house key, that much was clear. She'd pull up while he was gone, let herself inside, stay for an hour or two and leave. It became routine. Once, sometimes twice a week, I assumed she was his girlfriend. Then one evening I saw them together for the first time. Quinn pulled into the driveway with her in the passenger seat. That confirmed it, but something changed after that. Tension thickened between them. I could see it, even from my porch. One afternoon, while I was tending to my garden, I heard jouting. I looked up and saw them in his driveway. She was furious, arms flailing, her words sharp and venomous. Quinn stood still, his expression tired, almost resigned. And then she raised a hand. For a moment I thought she was going to strike him, but instead she turned, stormed to her car, slammed the door, and tore off down the street. Quinn exhaled, shook his head, and went inside. He hadn't even noticed me watching. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Her car showed up again. Quinn wasn't home. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time, she let herself in, stayed for a while, then left. Something was wrong. I told Benjamin, but he dismissed it. Not our business, he said. Maybe he was right. And then came the night. Everything fell apart. We woke to the sound of sirens. Blue and red lights flickered through our bedroom window, painting the walls in shifting shades of panic. Benjamin and I hurried outside, joining the small crowd of neighbors gathering in the street. Quinn's house was swarming with police. An ambulance sat in his driveway, back doors wide open. And then I saw her, the girl, handcuffed, silent. Her face was emotionless, her stare empty as the officers led her past us. She didn't fight, didn't speak, just walked. Then they wheeled Quinn out. He was covered in blood. I gasped. He was barely conscious, his face pale, his shirt soaked through. They loaded him into the ambulance, and then, just like that, he was gone. For a week, we heard nothing. When he finally returned, Benjamin and I went to check on him. He let us in without hesitation. He told us everything. Her name was Ellie. She wasn't supposed to have a key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. She had been watching him. She had access to his phone location. She always knew where he was. She had been inside his house more times than he could count. She had gone through his things. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the cameras. She had been planting hidden cameras in his bedroom. Every time she came over while he was gone, she wasn't just checking on the house. She was replacing batteries, making sure the cameras were still working, watching him. The argument I had witnessed, that had been Quinn's attempt to end things. Ellie refused, so she waited. She watched him through the cameras, and when she saw that he was alone the next night, she let herself in. She had a knife. I don't know exactly what happened next, but I do know that Quinn barely survived. He fought her off, but not before she managed to hurt him badly. The doctors told him he was inches from needing surgery, or worse. Benjamin and I tried to console him, but he was shaken, haunted. Before we left, he said one last thing. I learned my lesson about flaunting my money. People like that, they see it, and they latch on. He moved out soon after, said he didn't feel safe in that house anymore, that Ellie had friends, people just like her, and that they knew where he lived. We never saw him again. I pray he's okay. No one, especially someone so young, should ever have to go through something like that. When I moved into my new place, all I wanted was a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say an ex made it impossible for me to stay in my old city. I had come into some money early in life and made bad choices about the people I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to was exactly what I needed. Quiet, low crime, mostly families. The houses were spaced far apart, offering privacy. Strangely, though, the property next to mine sat much closer than the others, almost unnervingly close. And it was huge. When I first saw it, I figured it had to house a large family, grandparents, kids, the works. I couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't going to be a rude neighbor, so I made a point to introduce myself to everyone. Most of them were friendly, successful, and honestly, a little intimidating in that polished, upper-class kind of way. But my closest neighbor was the last one I introduced myself to, and I couldn't tell you why. Maybe some instinct held me back. That changed one evening when I finally walked up to the oversized house next door and knocked. The door swung open, and instead of some middle-aged family man, I was greeted by a guy my age, or younger, wearing a mullet and a massive grin. His energy caught me off guard. "Oh, wow," he said, cutting me off before I could even introduce myself. "Someone born in my decade. That's a surprise." I laughed, relieved. "Yeah, man, I was starting to feel out of place here." He introduced himself as Damon, and we chatted for a bit. He seemed cool enough, though something about him didn't quite sit right. Maybe it was the way his grin lingered a second too long, or how he hesitated when I asked what he did for a living. "Finance," he finally said, without elaborating. What really got me, though, was the fact that he lived in that massive house alone. He said it so casually, but it didn't make sense. I mean, yeah, I lived alone too, but my house wasn't half the size of his. We exchanged numbers, and I left feeling intrigued. Damon was the only person my age around, but the whole interaction stuck with me. For weeks, nothing happened. I texted Damon a few times to hang out, but he always had an excuse. Too busy, working late, maybe next time. Eventually, I stopped trying. I'm not the type to chase people for their time. The weird thing was, I never saw him leave the house, ever. His car never moved. No visitors, no takeout, nothing. It was like he wasn't even there. Working from home, my office overlooked Damon's place, so I'd glance over now and then, not in a creepy way, just out of curiosity. His house always looked empty, until one night, it wasn't. I woke up at 2 a.m. to loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so the sound hit me hard. Laughter, clinking glasses, voices overlapping in that unmistakable party chaos. I peeked out my window. Damon's driveway was packed with cars, so he does have friends. I wasn't about to call in a noise complaint, but it was the middle of the week, and the volume was ridiculous. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. The party was in full swing, or so I thought. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Figuring Damon was too drunk or distracted to hear me, I reached for the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned. The door swung open. Inside the house was silent. I stepped into the foyer. A pile of shoes lay by the door, at least 10 pairs. I moved into the living room, expecting to find people. Empty. The kitchen? Empty. Yet the sounds of a party still echoed through the house. Then I really listened. The music wasn't live. It was a recording, a fake party on loop. My stomach tightened. Something was very wrong. I should have left. But I didn't. I crept through the house until I noticed a door slightly ajar. It led down to the basement. A soft glow came from below. I should have turned around. Instead, I descended. The further down I went, the stronger a sharp chemical scent filled the air. Bleach, or some kind of industrial cleaner. A low, mechanical sound rumbled from somewhere deeper in the basement, like a machine whirring in slow, heavy rotations. Then I saw them. 3 men stood in the basement, all older than Damon. They wore thick gloves, work boots, and protective goggles. They were staring at something just out of my view. I inched forward, trying to see. The smell was making my eyes water. I had to stifle a cough. My gut screamed at me to leave. That's when the light behind me dimmed. Someone had shut the basement door. I didn't hear it over the music, but I felt it. A shift in the air, a presence behind me. I didn't think. I ran. I tore up the stairs, through the house and out the front door. But I didn't go home, not directly. I vaulted my fence and slipped through the back door of my house, locking it behind me. Heart pounding, I rushed to my office, staying low, barely peeking over the window. Minutes passed. Then the front door of Damon's house flew open. 8 men spilled out, scanning the street. They weren't looking for someone. They were looking for me. I held my breath as they argued. One of them shoved another, gesturing angrily. Then one by one, they disappeared back inside. The music stopped. The house went dark. The next morning, every car, including Damon's, was gone. Days passed. No sign of Damon. The packages by his door started piling up. The grass grew long, unkempt. It was like he had vanished. I asked my neighbors if they had heard the party that night. Every single one of them gave me the same confused look. They hadn't heard a thing. That was months ago. Damon's house remains empty. The mail keeps coming. No one comes to check on it. I still don't know what I saw in that basement. I still don't know what happened to Damon. And the worst part, I don't know if I want to.